although if you go back 2 weeks, people were saying, the idea this came from a lab was conspiratorial. This could very well have been the release of a natural virus from one of those two labs that people have been talking about. One of those two labs near Wuhan is the Wuhan Institute of Virology. It's a P4 biosafety lab. That's the highest level of safety. China has told us that they stored 1,500 varieties of coronavirus in that lab. And so a lot of people are saying, well, this is an accidental release. This gets to a number of different points that eventually I will answer your question. But look at what happened. This has been, a bug which has ravaged China. And China's leaders have known that. What they have done, though, is really striking. So, for instance, they knew about this in Beijing sometime, maybe first week of December, probably in November. In November, the second week of December, maybe the third week, leaders in Beijing knew that this could be transmitted from one human to the next. Because doctors in Wuhan knew that by at least the second week of December. But China's leaders didn't actually admit this to the world until January 20th. Now, just sort of sitting on that information would have been highly irresponsible. But it's much worse than that. What they did was, in that interim, where they knew that this was contagious, one person to the next, they actually tried to convince the world that it was not human-to-human transmissible. And we saw this, for instance, in that January 14th tweet from the World Health Organization, which said, based on information from China, we see no clear proof that this is transmitted from one human to the next. The reason why that's important is because Beijing actually tried to lull the world into a false sense of security. And at the same time, Patrick, Beijing was really working very hard to prevent countries from imposing travel restrictions on China. The way this bug got out of China was people who travel. Beijing did two things during a critical period. It tried to deceive the world about how this was transmitted, and it made sure that countries did not prevent people arriving from China. Now, I don't know what was in the mind of Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, but he saw clearly what the coronavirus did to his own country. It crippled China. So if he actually wanted to cripple other countries, he in fact would have done exactly what he did. I think that it's because Xi Jinping realized how bad things were in China. He wanted to level the playing field, the geopolitical playing field. So he allowed this virus, he actually deliberately took steps to push this virus outside of China to infect and hobble other societies.
Those are pretty powerful words, what you just said right there, Gordon. You just said intentional. So this was not accidental. This was intentional, done by them.
This was an intentional spread of the virus beyond China. Now,
how certain are you of that? I don't mean to interrupt, but when you say that, what level of certainty do you have in that statement?
It's just an issue of analysis that when you look at what they in fact did, there is no other explanation for it other than that they intentionally wanted this to spread beyond China. Because this is not just a question of keeping it secret because they were embarrassed. That would have been bad enough. That would have been highly irresponsible. But when they then tried to tell other countries, oh, don't worry about this. This can't be transmitted human to human. What it did was it actually took other public health officials in other countries that did not take those precautions that they otherwise would have adopted. And we also know something similar happened with their infection and death statistics. We heard the White House coronavirus task force coordinator, Dr. Deborah Birx, talk about how they looked at the statistics from China in terms of new cases and deaths. And they said, oh, this is like SARS, which was the 2002-2003 epidemic, which although it had a high mortality rate, was not very contagious. So basically what Beijing, what the White House did was essentially say, oh, okay, we don't have to take certain precautions. It was only after the U.S. saw what happened in Italy and Spain that they realized that they had a far bigger problem on their hands, that this would become not just an epidemic in China, but a global pandemic. It would affect the U.S. And that's why I think the White House took precautions much later than it otherwise would have. So you put all that stuff together, and the question is, well, why would Beijing do this? I can't think of another explanation other than that they saw that they had an opportunity to cripple other societies. I'm not saying that this is a bioweapon. I don't think that it was. But what they saw after it hurt China was that they decided that they were going to spread it through the rest of the world. What China's leaders did is a crime against humanity. If it isn't, then there is no such concept. There is no such thing. So I think countries need to hold Xi Jinping and other senior Chinese leaders responsible. And if we can ever get our hands on them, we need the 21st century version of the Nuremberg trials. We've never seen a crime like this in history. Unfortunately, that's the conclusion that we have to face. And, going forward for our children, forget ourselves, but for our children and for the rest of the world, we need to impose a cost on China so that no regime ever does this again.